Dark Deity 2 is alright. I've gone back and forth a bit on how to describe it, but I think that one single word describes it as best I can. I have a lot of issues with it which we'll get to, but it's an enjoyable experience for a reasonable price that's a massive improvement on its predecessor. That's about all I have to say as an introduction, so let's get into it.
I swear one of these days... Alden?
Not how I hoped to spend my night, but alas.
You better have found something useful at least.
Well, of course we did. Come on, when have we ever messed anything up?
Dark Deity 2 is the sequel to the Kickstarter-backed original, which was a turn-based strategy RPG heavily inspired by Fire Emblem. This served as a detriment in a lot of ways because of how obvious and in many cases unfavorable the comparisons were, and I should probably state that I generally didn't enjoy my time with it. Despite all its flaws though, there was definitely potential. While the execution was off, there was an obvious understanding on the parts of the developers as to what the appeal of Fire Emblem is. So I've been tracking the development of its sequel for a while, and I'm happy to say a lot of the missed potential of the original is achieved here. The story is a direct sequel to the original, starring the children of the first game's protagonist. Strange events are cropping up throughout the continent of Varroa, while a cartoonishly evil empire that dresses in black is posturing to break the peace by claiming random places as its territory. I find the narrative to be the weakest part of Dark Deity 2, as it's pretty meandering and does a poor job of establishing the setting before throwing it into chaos. I respect the game avoiding the standard early game exposition dumps over maps that strategy games gravitate to, but it doesn't really replace them with enough in the early dialogue to get the player up to speed. There's forces, countries, and organizations that have a lot of implied importance and are woefully underexplained. It's not necessarily confusing to follow because of how it matches a lot of the standard strategy JRPG template, but it's a roadblock to getting invested in the world. Compared to a lot of games that follow that template, however, it does have some pretty likable characters. It leans too much on quippy Marvel-style dialogue at certain points, but it at least avoids the politics-focused dryness some titles fall into. I wouldn't necessarily say the character writing is great, the development is pretty limited to the three children and even they don't get too much, but the moment-to-moment dialogue is at least pretty fun sometimes. As a whole, I think the story is well below average, but not in an offensive or obtrusive way.
Commander, how are we?
Lost some good men, but a lot less than we would have without your help. You really saved our hides, you know that?
We do. We can only hope the others made it out okay.
The big steps forward have come in the gameplay department as things have been refined and polished, with some subpar systems being removed and replaced with far more interesting options. Dark Deity 2 is a strategy RPG that closely resembles Game Boy Advance era Fire Emblem. Unlike many games in the genre, particularly those that emulate Final Fantasy Tactics, things are kept extremely simple within the main combat. Rather than unclear under-the-hood calculations, combat works with simple addition and subtraction. Take your attack, subtract the defense, that's how much damage you do. Take your accuracy, subtract the dodge, that's how likely you are to hit. There's nothing that can't be figured out by just looking at the stats of both yourself and the enemy. The downside of using additive instead of multiplicative calculations is that you have to get the enemy balance right or things become either a cakewalk or impossible. And thankfully Dark Deity 2 does a reasonably good job with this. Each map gives you an objective to complete, generally arriving to a certain spot or defeating a boss, and in general a 10-person squad to tackle it with. You'll move through the level taking on enemies and leveling up before finishing off the final objective and moving on to the next chapter. There will also be side objectives that grant some pretty substantial rewards if you complete them. Here's where we need to sort of establish something really important about Dark Deity 2. The difficulty is extremely customizable, to the point of having a built-in randomizer for multiple playthroughs. The main choice here though is whether or not to play with turn limits. With turn limits, the game is a challenging test of how you can best utilize your characters and their skills. However, it has the downside of forcing replays of chapters in situations where you reach close to the end and realize you can't quite complete it before the turn limit. I would still say this is the intended way to experience the game, with maps and side objectives being designed around the pace forced by turn limits. The big issue is how frustrating of a failure state this makes. Spending 20 minutes on a map only to be forced to restart from the beginning because you thought you could take a diversion to finish side objectives is a great way to kill motivation to play the game. You do have the option to play without turn limits, and despite the game and map design being built around it, I think this is probably what most people will gravitate towards. This is a much more relaxing experience, but it can feel a bit easy given that oddly the game does not have permadeath, nor does it seem to have an option for it. Death simply means a small debuff for that character on their next deployment, which makes sense given with turn limits, putting characters in danger is pretty unavoidable. But despite being a bit too easy, it's still an enjoyable experience to play with turn limits off. My personal recommendation would be to play with turn limits until you inevitably inevitably get frustrated with them, then turn them off. In what is otherwise extremely strong gameplay, this split between whether or not to have limits is probably the biggest weakness. I feel like the sense of urgency could have been replicated in other ways, through secondary objectives like racing enemy thieves to get chests or protecting NPCs. Simply forcing fast play through turn limits can feel artificial, but on the rest of the gameplay I'm largely positive. Gone is the awkward and unintuitive advantage system from the original title, and while there's no traditional weapon triangle style system to replace it, the new focus is now on a ton of active abilities. These are awesome and varied, with damage abilities, buffs, debuffs, and everything in between. I cannot stress how much strategic depth these add. Eventually you'll have access to 4 for each class alongside 1 that is character specific, and the range of different effects you have makes options feel endless. You can feel overpowered at times, but it's not necessarily in a bad way. Combining certain abilities with a robust and customizable equipment system, accessories, and even upgrades for each skill means with smart planning and resource management you can turn a character into an unstoppable juggernaut or a hyper-specialized role player. It's great, there's a ton here, but none of it is overwhelming or difficult to understand. It gives the players tools and trusts them to connect the dots. All of these strategic options mean that if you enjoy the game enough, there's an absolute mountain of stuff to do on repeat playthroughs. Harder difficulties are more interesting to tackle once you understand all of the systems and what you need to do on given maps. And if you're the type of person who wants to push yourself and tackle the absolute hardest content, the focus on active abilities means it's more thoughtful than the meat grinder a lot of max difficulty Fire Emblem playthroughs turn into. The map design, while not consistent, is still a massive step up from the original and more than good enough to create an interesting playground for the monstrosities you'll create in the late game. With 4 difficulties and a built-in randomizer, this is a game designed for repeat playthroughs. It's just a matter of if you enjoy the first one enough to start another run. Lastly, let's talk about the presentation because it's a massive mixed bag. Character portraits can range from solid to odd, like the main character Gwyn having a portrait with permanently crossed arms, which makes her look like the avatar of a YouTube video essayist. It's frustrating because there is some fantastic art here, it's just hidden away sometimes and the most frequent stuff looks the most basic. The sprite animation is fantastic, it shows its GBA era Fire Emblem influence, but that isn't a bad thing. The map backgrounds themselves look a bit simple though, and there's some elements like the world map on the main screen that look weirdly cheap. The one thing that isn't a mixed bag is the music, which is absolutely fantastic. The music in this game had no right to go this hard, but I'm not complaining. With fantastic tracks that dynamically change during player phase, enemy phase, and combat. A+, this is fantastic stuff. Dark Deity 2 has a lot of strong elements and a lot of weak elements, but the strong elements are good enough to carry the experience and the weak elements aren't enough to drag it down. It's a massive improvement over the original despite its flaws, and something strategy RPG fans, especially Fire Emblem fans, should look into, especially with a reasonably long demo available as well. It's not going to blow your mind or be your favorite game of all time, but Dark Deity 2 is alright. Noisy Pixel gives it a 7 out of 10. Thanks for watching, please remember to subscribe and consider checking out the Noisy Pixel Patreon. Stay tuned for news, reviews, previews, and more.
Noisy Pixel.